welcome to Hatchards. Welcome in particular to members of the SPAB. We're very glad to have you here. We're particularly glad, however, that you come for Mr. Davies, okay, who has done this marvellous book. The book came out last autumn. We have done so well with it, despite it being a very reasonable £50.
50.
Yeah, so extraordinarily cheap, and even cheaper to members of the SPAB, or frankly anybody else who wants it this evening. We'll give you all 10%. So now is the time to get it, particularly after this marvellous talk. Reasons why we did this talk was because I heard tell of a lecture you did in the city.
Yeah.
Which was said to be wonderful. So we have high hopes. But thank you all very much for coming. And if you find yourself short of drink and you think you can be brave enough to go get some more, do.
Right. Well, thank you, Francis. I hope you can all hear me, and I hope you can all see the screen, because it's a very visual presentation. And thank you all for coming this evening. I want you to actually immerse yourselves in the images as we go through the evening, travel back in time and absorb details of past lives and lost places, echoes perhaps of our own mortality. This melancholy London, I sometimes imagine the souls of the lost are compelled to walk through its streets perpetually. One feels them passing like a whiff of air. Well, maybe in the next hour or so, you will too. Now, between 1860 and 1920, London underwent its great transformation, the greatest since the Great Fire. In 1820, it was a major European city of around 1 million people. 100 years later, it was the largest city on earth with more than 7 million, 1/5 of the entire population of Britain. An urban leviathan, if you like, sprawling across over 17 miles from end to end, and described at the time by John Ruskin as a cancerous growth across the fair face of England. And its growth was unprecedented in human history. Until the late 1830s, the only visual means of conveying these massive changes was through paintings, woodcuts, and engravings, like this, for instance, on the left here, Hogarth's Gin Lane caricature. In the background, in the backdrop, you see the stepped steeple of St George's, Bloomsbury, and that's supposed to be the area around Seven Dial. But the graphic illustration continued throughout the 19th century and beyond, perhaps best embodied in the image you see on the right here, which is one of Gustave Doré's works, which illustrating Shad Thames, completed in 1872. But most people's impressions of Victorian London were, and indeed still are, reflected through the prism of Dickens' sublime prose. But in 1839, a revolutionary new advance transformed the ability to record the wider world: photography. Now, ever since the invention of the camera obscura by an Arab scholar 800 years earlier, scientists and inventors strove to capture and fix images of the wider world around them. And in 1826, the French inventor Joseph Nietzsche took the world's first photograph from his attic window using a pewter plate covered with bitumen, which he described as a sun picture or heliograph. But it was his compatriot Louis Daguerre who made photography a practical proposition with his daguerreotype, which he perfected quite by chance when he left an exposed plate of silver-plated copper in a cupboard where the mercury from a broken thermometer fixed the picture. Delicate and with a final image reversed, this sort of fortuitous accident triggered one of the greatest technological revolutions of the century. For the first time, people could see themselves and the world around them as they really were, rather than refracted through the subjective eye of the artist or the writer. Now, this is the earliest known photograph of London, taken in September 1839. A daguerreotype view of Whitehall with a statue of Charles I, you can see here in the foreground. Ethereal, unearthly, as if glimpsed through a sort of glass darkness. On closer examination, I hope you can see at least the outline of it. Two boys can be seen beside the bollards with a spectral image of the banqueting house in the background. All of that's a product of a long exposure time And this was the White Hall that the Duke of Wellington would have known. Queen Victoria had been on the throne for just 2 years, and Charles Dickens was completing his instalment of Oliver Twist at the very moment this photograph was taken. Now, one of the most astonishing early photographs of London was taken by the police of the Chartists' rally on Kennington Common on the 10th of April 1848. Taken on the northeast side, it captured one of the greatest political demonstrations of the 19th century, and the ghostly chimney of farmers' vitriol works can be seen in the background in the far distance, almost in silhouette or in negative. Now, as processes were refined, photography took the country by storm. And within 15 years, street photographers were absolutely soon hawking their skills to even the poorest classes, like here in London Road Borough. And photography was the Instagram of the Victorian age, accessible to all. One commentator at the time wrote, "The sixpenny photograph is doing more for the poor than all of the philanthropists in the world." And if you look at some of the images of some of the poorest built places in London, the poorest houses, the interiors, many will have a photograph of a loved one on the mantelpiece. So the camera offered a quantum leap in both spontaneity and realism. And yet until recently, photographs of the period have been largely ignored by historians in favour of documentary sources. So this evening we look at just two aspects: how photography was used to record the physical transformation of the city, the London that was vanishing, and then briefly as a tool for social reform. Now, from the mid-19th century, London was rent asunder by wave after wave of new infrastructure for roads, railways, public works and metropolitan improvements. And Dickens described the turmoil in one of his books, in Dombey and Son, and he wrote, "Deep pits and trenches dug in the ground, enormous heaps of earth and clay thrown up, buildings undermined and shaking, propped up by beams of wood, carcasses of ragged tenements, piles of scaffolding and wildernesses of brick, and giant cranes and tripods straddling above nothing." And it's much the same today if you look at HS2 construction. But here are some images of the mayhem that Dickens so graphically described, which is the cut and cover construction of the Metropolitan District Railway between 1863 and 1868, which cut a swathe through the capital. This is Craven Hill in Bayswater. There are the tripods above the open void beneath. This is Praed Street in Paddington. Again, this cut and cover construction you can see taking form in the foreground, and then further east in front of Somerset House, again for the same railway construction. Now in 1862, Charles Fowler's elegant Hungerford Market, seen here, was ruthlessly flattened for the Charing Cross terminus of the London and South Eastern Railway. A huge new station and hotel, designed by E.M. Barry, rose on the site in its eclectic Renaissance style, with a replica of the medieval Eleanor Cross in the foreground. There we are. Not that different today, really, although the top stories have been remodelled following bomb damage. The turmoil, as I say, currently being reaped by HS2, occurred on a similar scale over 150 years earlier, when the Midland Railway scythed through the poor districts of Somers Town to terminate here at St Pancras, which you can see in all its glory, and the vacant sites to the left where the British Library now stands. Once reviled as a Victorian monstrosity, it's now rightly regarded as one of the finest buildings of the railway age. And on completion, the train shed behind the hotel frontage here was the largest ironwork structure in the world. A revolutionary design of bowstring trusses, which you can see under construction here, tied to the ribs to leave the train shed free of intermediate support. And here, seen from Euston Road on the left, and to the right, you can see the staging that was progressively moved down the train shed for the construction of the trusses. Now, at virtually the same time, huge new road schemes were being driven through the heart of London, like here at Holborn Viaduct. This was one of the most ambitious and took over 6 years to build, and was described in the Daily News as a waste and howling wilderness of hoarding. Spanning the valley of the River Fleet, it eliminated the long haul up Holborn Hill, levelled the notorious slum district around Field Lane that Dickens wrote about, the location of Fabian's Den in All the Twist, and transformed connections between the city and home. And I'm endlessly intrigued by the couple standing on the right of the picture there, intimately sort of talking to each other. Who were they? It raises so many sort of intriguing questions. Were they young lovers, perhaps? I don't know. With their posture, maybe. But the viaduct itself contained huge new multi-level underground chambers for sewers and services. And this picture here shows those under construction, with St Andrew's Holborn to the left. And with the creation of the London County Council in 1889, the great transformation gathered further momentum. Rosebery Avenue was carved through Finsbury and the old Coldbath Fields prison. And these were the men who hand-built the new London. Gangs of navvies dressed in suits and bowler hats, the surveyors and the clerks of works to the fore. But new technology was also enthusiastically embraced, but not always successfully. Like here, also in Rosebery Avenue, this is the Pluto hot water lamp. Seen in this absolutely splendid photograph, it was an early form of vending machine dispensing halfpenny helpings of cocoa, tea or beef essence, complete with a telegraph recorder connected to Scotland Yard for police use. Sadly, it was much abused and removed after just 6 months in 1899, along with its prototype in Leicester Square. People kept putting sort of little tin pieces of metal in instead of coins. But it wasn't just transport infrastructure. This is Crossness sewage treatment works out on the Erith marshes, seen here being completed in 1864. It was part of the massive investment overseen by Sir Joseph Bazalgette to improve hygiene and sanitary conditions in the capital. And Bazalgette, I'm sure he's amongst the throng there. I think he's the gentleman with the cane at the front. Difficult to see the detail on the screen. But in parallel with the colossal level of change that was taking place, there was growing awareness of the London that was vanishing. And one of the earliest people to record these changes on an area-wide basis was somebody called William Strudwick. And in the 1860s, he recorded the ancient buildings and alleys of Lambeth Riverside, prior to the construction of the Albert Embankment, and an astonishing series of relatively little-known pictures. And this chaotic maze of insanitary riverside housing and workshops was plagued by annual tidal flooding, and it devastated the low-lying, squalid tenements alongside the river and bred dirt, disease and death. And the framework for the new embankment can be seen rising on the foreshore in the foreground. Left is the view of Lambeth Palace and St Mary's Church from Lambeth High Street, and on the right, Lower Fore Street leading to the river with raised cellar traps to stop flooding into the basements of the houses. This is Church Street, just immediately outside Lambeth Palace, and it's a fascinating group of 17th and 18th century buildings, including Bunyan's Hall, this building with a very steeply pitched roof in the foreground here. The man on the left, standing by the lamp column there, was Mr. Lever from the local boat building family. But notice how small he is in relation to the lamp column, because the average height for a man in 1860 was just 5 feet. Closer to Lambeth Walk was Lambeth Palace, was Bishop's Walk, lined with 17th century houses facing the garden wall of Lambeth Palace to the left, taken in April 1866. And behind here were boat yards and barge builders, but the entire area was swept away for the new London, which was, in this case, St Thomas's Hospital, completed in 1868, built to Florence Nightingale's principles, interlinked pavilions to maximise light and ventilation and minimise the risk of cross-infection between the wards. But Lambeth was also the centre of pottery industry, including Dalton's famous works. This was Princes Street in 1865, 17th and 18th century houses with huge pots adorning the parapet of John Cliffe's imperial potteries. This was Lower Fore Street. And to the left, the lath and plaster of a gable end of a 17th century house can be seen, lying exposed. And to the right in Upper 4th Street was Alfred Hunt's Chemical Works, where animal bones were crushed for lime fertiliser or boiled for soap alongside the houses of the poorest. Pools of toxic fog hung over the entire area. But buried within this labyrinth were astonishing historic buildings. And this 16th century house survival, known as Guy Fawkes House, was leased by Robert Catesby as a base for the conspirators involved in the gunpowder plot. Guy Fawkes never actually lived here, but he certainly visited. And then some wider views. Lambeth Suspension Bridge, completed in 1862 to replace the earlier horse ferry, hence Horse Ferry Road on the north bank. This is the Lambeth foreshore in 1866, viewed from the same suspension bridge looking south. We thought it was Pottery Wharf next to the Ship Tavern. And then the view from the bridge opposite, looking downstream towards the Palace of Westminster in 1867. This maze of wharves and industrial buildings lining the foreshore, where Victoria Tower Gardens now stands. Strudwick died penniless in the Croydon Union Workhouse in 1910. And until recently, the unique value of his work has remained largely unrecognised. Anchored by the loss of London's historic buildings and ancient neighbourhoods, in 1875, the Society for Photographing Relics of Old London was formed to record places threatened with demolition, and in particular, old 17th century houses and ancient coaching inns made redundant by the growth of the railways. Henry Dixon and Alfred and John Boole took over 120 photographs, leaving a legacy of immense historical value. And so very soon others raced to record what was being lost, fueling public concern and the growth, of course, of the modern conservation movement, not least the foundation of the SPAB. So in the words of Ralph McTell, let me take you by the hand and lead you through the streets of London as they once were. 1875. Lying in the shadow of St Paul's next to Newgate Prison, the Oxford Arms is one of London's most evocative coaching inns, and its demolition led directly to the formation of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings in 1879. This is another view of the courtyards there. 1875. This is Sir Paul Pinder's house in Bishopsgate, a superb Jacobean building which survived the Great Fire and later became a workhouse and coaching inn. Demolished in 1890 for the expansion of Liverpool Street Station. But even then, the elaborate oak frontage was considered so important that it was saved by the V&A, where it can still be seen. At Borough High Street, a whole series of ancient inns had served coach traffic to South East England since the time of Chaucer. Dickens described them as great rambling queer old places with galleries, passages and staircases, antiquated enough to furnish material for 100 ghost stories. And there you have a very ghostly view of the White Hart, just poised on the brink of oblivion. It's the Queen's Head with its distinctive scalloped ornament, and the King's Head with its Chinese Chippendale balustrading. They too all succumbed. Only one range of the Georgian in Southwark now survives, owned by the National Trust. Back in the city, in 1883, Aldgate was lined with medieval buildings that you can see on the left here. Butcher's shops and shambles, with the Turk's Head part of the centre. And to the right, this refined 17th century, extraordinary, superb medieval house to the right of the Turk's Head in the middle. And the house, I hope you can see, has carved animal heads over the first floor windows, indicating this was a centre for the meat trade at the time. To the right is a refined 17th century classical house in Great Winchester Street in the city, embellished with Corinthian pilasters. Cloth Fair in Smithfield evoked how medieval London looked and felt before the Great Fire, and it was recorded by the Society. Ancient timber frame buildings overhanging a maze of narrow alleys and crammed alongside St Bartholomew's the Great Church. Another view of the Cloth Fair buildings to the left and to the right is the old Dick Whittington Inn, built around 1550, pierced with later Georgian sash windows. John Galsworthy wrote of the houses like these. These are houses whose souls have passed into the limbo of time, leaving their bodies in the limbo of London, as indeed are some of those that follow. This group were all clearly city corporation in the early 20th century. Nearby, Aldersgate contained many superb historic buildings like these. To the left is a staggering survival of a timber-framed late 16th century house, originally the Sun and Moon Tavern. You can see elaborate oak posts rising through the upper floors, with later sash windows and projecting bays. And the connection with Shakespeare, it says Shakespeare's house is entirely spurious. To the right stood this group of similar late 16th century houses. Here too, though, was this house, which was Shaftesbury House, built in 1641, erroneously attributed to Inigo Jones. It was an early example of the classical style deployed for a London townhouse. And the Duke of Monmouth hid here after the failure of his rebellion in 1685. All were demolished shortly after these photographs were taken. And not even the great London landmarks were safe. Temple Bar. Well, Temple Bar restricted the traffic at the entrance to the city. And in 1878, it was dismantled and rebuilt on a private estate at Theobald's Park in Enfield. But later triumphantly relocated back to London beside St Paul's in 2004. To the left is the view towards St Clement's Danes, facing west, Wych Street, which we'll come on to in a minute. To the right, the view towards the city with the figures of Charles I and Charles II in the niches. These are the dreadful walls of Newgate, which have hidden so much misery and unspeakable anguish in Dickens' words. Until 1868, public executions were held outside the prison here, attracting huge crowds. And afterwards they took place inside, when a bell would toll and a black flag would be flown over the jail. The whole complex was cleared for the London Central Criminal Courts, and the book has actually really rare photographs of the intimidating interior of the building and some of the burials inside the building. But this pattern of destruction and change was repeated all over London. This is Drury Lane. Looking on the left-hand side, looking westward towards the steeple of St Mary le Strand, prior to the clearance of the entire area for the Holborn Strand Improvement Scheme from 1905 onwards. The old Cock and Magpie Tavern on the left there was built in the 1620s, sitting in the foreground. To the right is this astonishing view of the time-worn, timber-framed Jacobean houses in Wych Street. And in the haze beyond, you can just see the steeple of St Clement Danes. And the demolition of this group of early houses, timber-framed houses, caused real consternation at the time. There was a real pushback in the press over that. This was the junction of Holywell Street and Wych Street. And note the colossal lantern suspended from some sinuous overthrow there. And that was not uncommon in the sort of turn of the century. Sometimes these lanterns and pub signs were so massive that they pulled the facades off the buildings. Extraordinary things. And this is what transformed the entire area. This is Old Wych in 1910, for the beginnings of quite an advanced construction of Old Wych, pending the completion of Australia House there on the corner. Built around 1610, Northumberland House was one of central London's last great aristocratic houses, with grounds running down to the Thames, demolished in 1874 for the creation of Northumberland Avenue. And the roof of the new station hotel at Charing Cross can be seen in the skyline just behind the Percy Lion there. Just around the corner was Morley's Hotel, just next to St Martin's in the Fields. But in the Strand to the right, you'll see the sort of peculiar structure on the roof of the building in Strand, the pepper pot. That was the electric signal time ball, which was connected to Greenwich, and at 1 o'clock daily it fell to provide the precise time in central London before clocks were universally accessible. And there's some more views of central London. This is the north side of Leicester Square with the back of Shakespeare's statue at the centre around 1895. Piccadilly Circus in its heyday, with a group of flower sellers to the left and a battery of gas lamps in the sort of middle distance, with an oculus below which stood over a public convenience. And this eerily quiet view of Regent Street about 1865 shows Nash's spectacular original curved quadrant. And the original iron colonnades were removed in 1848 because they masked the shops and were also notorious for soliciting, and later replaced by the continuous iron brackets, continuous bracketed balconies rather, you see here. Traffic congestion is nothing new. This is looking west in Piccadilly in 1897. And this is one of London's lost masterpieces on the left here. This magnificent Venetian Gothic palazzo was designed by Walter Emden in 1874 as the St James's restaurant, with entrance to a concert hall behind where Grieg, Liszt and Dvorak all performed. It was short-lived, alas, and replaced by Norman Shaw's Piccadilly Hotel in 1905. And on the right is the Walsingham Hotel. 8 years later, it was levelled for the construction of the Ritz, down the road here, one of the largest steel frame buildings in London. And then two views of Westminster. Left, of course, is the Victoria Tower of the Palace of Westminster in 1861, rising 360 feet above the Georgian buildings of Millbank. To the right is Westminster Abbey in 1885, with Gilbert Scott's Crimean War Memorial column in the foreground. But outside of the centre lay whole districts with their own distinct identity, including streets of Georgian and Regency buildings, which form the day-to-day backcloth of people's lives. This is Great Queen Street on the left here, and Great Wild Street on the right. This is Seven Dials, once a notorious rookery, and now today a fashionable quarter of Covent Garden, which epitomises the constantly shifting kaleidoscope of London's districts. And note the cast iron street urinal to the extreme right and the granite set road surface. Shaftesbury Avenue and Charing Cross Road were carved through the slums of Soho in the 1880s, providing opportunities for brand new entertainment venues like the Palace Theatre of Varieties, you can see here, designed by T. Colcott in red brick and terracotta. But of course, waves of immigration have constantly transformed London's neighbourhoods, adding to local distinctiveness. Left is Eyre Street Hill in Clerkenwell, known as Little Italy in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the haunt of Italian immigrants. And to the right is an Italian ice cream seller. But take a look and you will see that his son has actually had both arms amputated. It's quite difficult to see on this scale. If you buy the book, you'll see very clearly the extraordinary image. And again, you can't help but wonder, how did that happen? Was it an industrial accident? Was it congenital? We just don't know. Nearby were these fine 17th century jetted houses in Gray's Inn Lane. In the foreground, that's exactly the same as buildings, which is the exit for Gray's Inn itself. And other extraordinary survivals could be found right across the country, like this unique house in Well-Close Square, Wapping, reminiscent of the weatherboarded houses of New England. And these in Whitechapel Road and Mile End Road in the East End. And this is Poplar High Street in 1875. One stalls in the centre there was a classic oil and hardware shop with oil jars crowning the fascia, and the entire area was obliterated by post-war redevelopment. White Horse on the left there, which remains in an entirely modern context. The rest of the street having long since gone. This is the junction of Tottenham Court Road and Euston Road in 1904, with a platoon of lamp columns on the left lining the footway, all cleared 60 years later for the Euston underpass. And this was day-to-day London, if you like, in Euston Road in 1904, and the ship's mast advertises Dunhill sacks, ropes and tarpaulins, and two men can be seen perched precariously on the rooftop telegraph pole against the skyline there, before the days of health and safety. Close by, of course, was Euston Arch, designed by Philip Hardwick in 1838 as the triumphal entrance to the station, and its demolition in 1962 prompted a national outcry. It was one of the landmark cases in the development of the modern conservation movement. And here are two images of major highways south of the river. The books cover this. Westminster Bridge Road, taken by George Washington Wilson around 1900. Only the clock tower of the Palace of Westminster remains. Both sides of the street were swept away, the County Hall on one side and improved access to St Thomas's Hospital on the other. And in the 1960s, an appalling island block was built across the road, blocking the whole view of this iconic view of the palace, destroying one of London's great vistas. And London still desperately needs a coherent vision for its urban design, rather than the speculative free-for-all and ad hoc development control. This is the rich, multi-layered townscape of Borough High Street in about 1900 again, looking south towards the Church of St George the Martyr, lined with buildings of different periods on their original plots, bustling with mixed uses and vibrant street life. Street life has now largely vanished from the capital. This is a view from the south end looking north. That's the Church of St George the Martyr. Church with Little Dorrit was married in Dickens' novel. Some more eccentric buildings here. This is in Bermondsey High Street in 1881, and these extraordinary Elizabethan timber-framed houses were once the centre of the highly toxic leatherwork trade, and the upper parts are imperforate with the timber louvers that you see there for ventilation. Nearby, this is Long Lane, Southwark, on the 19th of July 1900. Patriotic decorations for the Bermondsey Carnival to raise funds to relieve local families affected by the Boer War. And before the introduction of advertisement controls, the gable ends of houses and shop fronts were a perpetually changing array of posters. And on a very personal note, you probably can't read it, but the lowest of the posters on the left there, on the left-hand image, is promoting a play called The Little Minister, featuring Winifred Emery, who was my grandmother's cousin. So a personal thing that came up quite by chance. To the left, Dickens passed this shop on the left in Borough Road, daily en route to his lodgings in Lant Street. And he wrote about the figure of a Highlander outside, the trade symbol of a tobacconist. But again, look closely at this and you will see that the photo is actually of a young boy in Highlander dress, recreating the scene that Dickens recalled for the photographer. And often the photos capture fascinating current events, like here in Limehouse. This is 1916, with coverage of home law for Ireland and war news, and the Labour leader, it says, sent to prison was Fenner Brockway. Nearby was this shop, Israel Rosenberg shop in St George Street, which was typical of many of the period. And the young Rosenberg boy in the doorway stands beside his older sister, who was later killed in the Blitz. But in wealthier areas, mahogany shop fronts with brass fittings, applied lettering and lanterns all conveyed quality, like the shop in Crouch End Broadway in 1900. And it's a measure of the collapse, I think, of high street design that today we tolerate cheap, standardised aluminium units and garish plastic signs, the lowest common denominator. The river runs like an umbilical cord through London, and its raw tidal energy provides the lifeblood of the city, the very reason for its foundation. And in this 1870s panorama, St Paul's hovers, you can see, majestically above the temples of trade lining the river. 1885, this is a view towards Queen Hythe, with St Paul's again floating serenely above the city, and the towers and spires of Wren's churches punctuating the skyline. Vessels of grace on the waters of eternity. This was Paul's Wharf in its heyday, in mixed use as a granary, glassworks and iron founders, very typical of what you found along the river in the city at that time. And to the right is the riverfront of mudlarks, ferrymen and watermen, graphically described or evoked by Dickens in Our Mutual Friend. London Bridge in 1880 with the Tower of St Magnus the Martyr and the monument rising behind. South Bank to the left, St Mary Overy Dock in 1881, and Tower Bridge on the right here, nearing completion in 1893, with a battery of howitzers and shells from the Royal Armouries in the foreground. Further east, this is Limehouse Reach in 1890, looking eastward into a miasma of River Fog. Again, another incredibly evocative view. London Docks in 1880, the east end of the North Quay stacks, built by Daniel Alexander, the architect of Dartmoor Prison, between 1801 and 1805, and the quays covered with barrels of wine and brandy. Very much the sort of the London docks in their heyday. Two great monumental gateways. To the left is the gateway to East India Dock, demolished in 1912, and to the right, West India Dock, destroyed in 1932. Albeit the one on the right has been rebuilt, smaller in replica. And then dark satanic mills. Even these massive industrial buildings could be imbued with a sense of the sublime. Albert Bridge Flour Mills, you can see on the left, around 1884, stood next to Ransom's Dock in Battersea. Robinson's Flour Mills at Deptford Creek was a state-of-the-art 8-storey colossus which survived until the 1970s. And in this view, from the window of William Whiffin's photographic studio in Poplar, and restored to the book, you can see the tall masts of the ships, again much clearer in the book, in the East India Dock, in the distant haze, shimmering and giving you a very interesting juxtaposition between Poplar and the docks. But of course, in living memory, Docklands was full of these startling juxtapositions like this. In Millwall in 1918, with the prow of a ship called the Milverton towering over Manchester Road. Again, long before the days of health and safety, somebody working at the end of the prow. Now, increasingly, photography was used also as an instrument for social reform, and in particular images of the poor and the destitute. And in 1877, John Thompson carried out the first exercise in photographic social documentation of any kind ever carried out in England. And using photographs alongside first-hand testimony, he portrayed the precarious lives of street people in touching detail in a book called Street Life in London. And here are just two. And each picture tells a very personal story of the individuals involved. To the left is the street doctor, rendered blind from exposure and cold in his previous job as a carman. His wife supported him by charring by day and sewing shirts for tuppence halfpenny a night until 3 o'clock in the morning. On recovering his sight, he set up in business and made a good living. But notice his raised right boot, which suggests, again, some sort of crippling injury or congenital problem. On the right, Joseph Carney was an enterprising fishmonger at Seven Dials, and the boy in the foreground with a pitcher was called Little Mick-Mac Gosling, 17 years old, but only 3 feet 3 inches tall. The disdainful man in the tall silk hat behind him, at the back there, was the owner of the houses behind the stalls there, who thoroughly disapproved of the street market in front of his property. And all this was meticulously captured at the time in the narrative, the pictures. Now, anyone who looks back with nostalgic notions of Victorian England should think again, because for the vast majority of people, daily life was a hard, unremitting grind. Downton Abbey, it wasn't. Others, like the American novelist Jack London and Horace Warner, followed in the footsteps of Thompson to record the social conditions of the East End. And to finish, here are some poignant images of the people of the abyss, as they were referred to, which I find incredibly moving, as the poor struggle to exist in the most squalid conditions. They capture people long since past, frozen in time. Poor children of all ages had to work in home industries like waste paper collection to make family ends meet, you can see here. Social deprivation Well, this is G Street in Somers Town in 1920. It's over 100 years ago. This is Mrs. Fry and her child in a single room surrounded by all their worldly possessions. Nearby, in Drummond Street, this worn-out man lived in a one-room basement workshop and living room, and again, typical of the conditions of many people in the poorer parts of London at the time, as late as the 1920s. And this is the ceremonial burning of the bugs in Somers Town, symbolically marking the construction of new houses in Somers Town, which caused a great local celebration. The man with the lighting of the bonfire is General Sir Ian Hamilton during the First World War. Chronic poverty. This isn't the East End or Bankside, but King's Cross in 1897, in an enclave of back-to-back housing off Gray's Inn Road, known locally as Cat's Meat Square. Courtyard housing. It's around 1900, almost certainly in the infamous Old Nickel slum in Shoreditch, now the site of the Boundary Estate, the world's first council estate. You can see the children are barefoot, a sign of ingrained poverty, and yet again in this image, nearby, I'm sure, on the area now covered by the Boundary Estate. 1868, Hope Place was the first settled home of the East End Juvenile Mission, in 2 cottages that you can see here. This was the beginning of the Dr. Barnardo's homes, and Barnardo saved, by the time of his death, over 60,000 children from the streets of London. The East End also stood in the vanguard of social reform and women's suffrage. And Sylvia Pankhurst is captured on the shot on the left, painting Votes for Women on a fascia of her headquarters in Bow Road. Suffragettes and feminists also mobilised people to care for poor children suffering from malnutrition during the First World War, when money was in short supply. Soldiers were being paid for their service at the front, but they quite often didn't get sent back to their families. And this shocking portrait on the right was taken at a place called the Mother's Arms, a converted pub, originally called the Gunmaker's Arms, so it's a pacifist symbol, in Old Ford Road in 1915. And it's sort of reminiscent of the images that one saw from Biafra in the 1960s. Extraordinary that this was taking place in London in the First World War. But let me end. No, there's one more before I do. This is Betts. This is Tisdall Place in Southwark. This is Betts, a disabled local costermonger whose hand had been caught in a circular saw. But do let me end with the teeming streets of Spitalfields. Many of the images that are in the book come from the wonderful archive and the Bishopsgate Institute. This is a crowd outside the pub at the junction of Sands Row and Artillery Lane in Spitalfields. And for many, the pubs provided a welcome refuge of warmth and companionship in a rather bleak world. This again is an extraordinary image. April 1912. To the left is one of London's finest 18th century shop fronts, built in 1756 and still surviving. This is instantly recognisable if you go there today. But sometimes the images capture momentous events quite by chance. And the placard on the corner shop in the distance there announces the loss of the Titanic on the 15th of April. Left here is Whitegate Street with the end of Artillery Passage with the early 18th century house on the corner. And to the right, a group of Jewish school children in the yard of just emerged from the Sands Row Synagogue behind them. It's a great area of immigration for Jewish refugees from the pogroms of Eastern Europe at the time. This is photorealism. This is one of Jack London's most extraordinary photographs. The morning rush for breakfast in the yard of the Salvation Army Barracks in Whitechapel Road in 1902. And just look at the faces of the men queuing up. They've got vouchers for their breakfast. This is Petticoat Lane. Another image by Jack London where clearly he, as the photographer, is the focus of curiosity. And 2 views in and out of Union Place, Spitalfields, a labyrinth of courtyards and alleyways just behind Commercial Street, taken by Horace Warner. But note on the right-hand image, just you can see the face of a man peering over the wall in the right-hand picture. 1902, City of Lost Children. In the East End, 55% of children died before their 5th birthday. In the West End, it was 18%. But in spite of appalling child mortality rates, the alleys and courts of areas like Spitalfields and Whitechapel thronged with children, like here in Paul's Square on the left, and Providence Place, close to Bishopsgate Goods Yard on the right. And here on the left in Frying Pan Alley, more children again thronging the very narrow alleyway. And to the right, just an example of one of the doss houses that over 900,000 people slept in every night. Again, another Jack London photograph. London was the city of dreadful night, and people of all ages who couldn't afford 4pence a bed for a doss house slept on the streets. The gardens around Christchurch Spitalfields were known as Itchy Park on account of the vermin, but were a refuge for the homeless. And here are just some of the unfortunates asleep early in the morning. The alternative for these people was the workhouse, which people tried to avoid at all costs. And this was the inside of the men's ward of the Whitechapel workhouse, the inmates picking oakum. But let me finish with 2 haunting pictures. This is, to the left, Annie Lyons and her little sister Nellie, taken by Horace Warner in 1902. Just 2 of 10 children in the family, of whom half died in childhood. The sadness in their eyes reflects a life of deprivation. One of their older brothers can be seen mischievously photobombing the picture through the window behind. And finally, on the right, most poignant of all perhaps, is this now very famous photograph taken in 1875 by John Thompson on the steps of the workhouse in Short's Gardens, 7 Dials. And her story is that, cast out by misfortune, having lost her husband 10 years earlier, this poor woman was reduced to sleeping in doorways, along with the destitute poor. She's seen here caring for a friend's child, and she explains to the author, John Thompson, "It pushes its little head under my chin when it's very cold, and cuddles up to me so that it keeps me warm as well as itself. The child cried, wheezed and coughed, protected from the rain and sleet only by the filthy shawl that she wore, and it was unlikely to have survived." These are just a handful of snapshots of a few Londoners affected by the great transformation of the capital. The present is the child of the past, and many of the issues affecting Victorian and Edwardian London were identical to those of today. Technological change, social displacement, immigration, poverty, economic downturn, poor housing, public health, war, our relationship with Europe and the wider world. All of these are common issues today. And London was and remains a city of extremes, a tale of 2 cities. So perhaps let Charles Dickens have the final word from his eponymous novel. Depending on who you were and the accident of birth, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We were all going to heaven, we were all going the other way. In short, it was, so far, like the present period. So thank you.